with me last year during COVID, and we were looking at the state of Black America through a COVID lens. And so we will continue to do that conversation as long as COVID is with us. But today we're going to talk about critical race theory. And you know, critical race theory is not a new term, but Kimberly Crenshaw, y'all know Kimberly Crenshaw, um, um, uh, uh, resurrected the word in a academic paper. You know, when you're trying to teach white folks some stuff, they get all up in their feelings. And Kimberly Crenshaw is a part of the Black intelligentsia. Like, she is a Black intellectual. I know her partner because I got invited to Vassar a couple of years back to sit in a class on I guess African American studies of some sort, and I got to sit in the class and I got to talk about. So I was invited to come and be a part of the class, and it was quite moving, and I so enjoyed it. First of all, Babz is very pretty, and second of all, I've got to you know, see these little kids learn about learn all kinds of things about the world. So anyway, Kimberly Crenshaw resurrected the word. It got folks all upset, and you know. There's a whole bunch of scholars and intellectual, Kiara Bridges, Kimberly Crenshaw, I dare say Dr. Robert M. Brown, Derek Bell, Cheryl Harris, Richard Delgado, Patricia Williams, Gloria Ladson Billings, Tara Yoso.
Babz, I don't mean to interrupt you, but
What?
is Schultz and Company, is that Dr. Brown?
It might be.
Okay.
Yes, because that's his partner's company, and I think he works with her too.
Well, we'll see if this is him. He should be coming in. Yep, there he goes.
Oh, hey! Unmute yourself. It is so good to see you,
Good to
Dr.
see you
Robert
too.
M. Brown III.
Good to see you as well.
I was just talking about all the architects of critical race theory, all the Black intelligentsia. You know, Kimberly Crenshaw and Derek Bell, and you know, all the heavy hitters, and you.
Yeah.
So, thank you for coming. I feel like I haven't seen you in so long.
Feels like that, doesn't it? I know it was the summer the last time we had a
Yes.
conversation. So it's been
You were
a
at my
little while.
birthday party.
Oh, well, happy belated.
You were there, so it was great.
Oh yeah.
Who else is coming in the waiting room? Who else? Uh-oh, I don't know. Harry, find out who that is in the waiting room, because I don't know who that is. Are you expecting more people?
No.
Okay, me either. So I don't know what's happening. I hope I didn't double book people, but that could be it.
Oh, okay.
Or they got the dates mixed up or the time
Okay.
mixed up. That's all right. So we're gonna talk about critical race theory.
We're going to talk about critical race theory.
Oh, why are white folks so up in arms about this?
Well,
And Condoleezza Rice too.
well, there are certain people in this country who have a very peculiar relationship with the truth. And critical race theory simply seeks to uncover that. But I thought what might be useful, Babz, is to, if you'll allow me, to go back in time to talk about the ways that critical race theory really evolved in this country. And if you go back to 1956, that was the year that President Dwight Eisenhower signed into law the Interstate Highway Act.
Mm-hmm.
And this was a game changer because it provided resources, funding to create a transcontinental system of travel. So this resulted in the building of roads, bridges, but especially interstate highways. And it is because of the Interstate Highway Act of 1956, 65 years ago, that we were able to make tremendous advances in not just our ability to travel from one part of the country to another, but more important, I think, is the ways in which it helped to increase our capacity to bring goods from one part of the country to another via truck. And so as a result of this piece of legislation, the extent to which commerce was able to take place in America vastly increased. But along with the Interstate Highway Act of 1956 came something very, very diabolical. And that was the fracturing of many Black communities around the country. Mm-hmm. What happened was that many of these communities were literally torn apart because of these highway projects. And this was happening across the country, but I'll just name a few cities on the East Coast in which these endeavors were taking place. So you had cities like Orlando, Birmingham, Alabama, Atlanta, Georgia, Charleston, South Carolina, Charlotte, North Carolina, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Syracuse, New York, and the list goes on and on and on. These were vibrant, self-sustaining communities that were ripped apart, and because of the highways that were literally driven through the center of those cities, Black people lost their homes, they lost their schools, they lost their churches, and they lost their businesses. As bad as this was, what was even worse was these communities, Babz, were never made whole again. They were largely left to themselves. And what happened was the increase in joblessness, the increase in economic instability, the increase in overcrowded homes and communities, the depletion of entrepreneurship and entrepreneurial activities in these spaces. And what it also resulted in was hyper-segregation, which kept Black people from interacting with white people. So these highways were literally the barrier between white and Black communities. And one of the examples that I'd like to just share with you as a literal testament to the ways in which this structural racism was adversely impacting Black communities was to talk about a man by the name of Robert Moses, who was an influential New York public official who was shaping urban development and public work projects in New York in the 1950s. Mm-hmm. He went to great lengths, actually, to build New York's roads and highways in such a way that would limit the ability of Black people, brown people, and poor people to visit parks and beaches that were built for white people and that were typically in the suburbs or outside of New York City. And so what he did was he instructed the highway engineers at that time to build bridges across the Southern State Parkway with 1 foot less clearance than the bridges on the Hutchison, Sawmill, and Bronx River Parkway. So obviously what this did was it kept Black, brown, and poor people from coming into those spaces where whites resided. As a result of that, the buses could not get under those bridges. And what ended up happening was he believed that Black people would be more likely to use local roads to access the beach, which would make it far less desirable to do. And so we had a number of these types of occurrences that were taking place in the 50s and 60s. And what eventually began to happen was the emergence of a number of civil rights organizations, such as the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, the National Urban League, and other organizations who were really beginning to take this to court to make legal arguments about the ways in which the construction of these roads, bridges, and highways and interstates were presenting a detrimental impact on Black communities and other communities of color and poor communities, but especially Black communities. Unfortunately, the legislation at the time had very little teeth to be able to combat these policies. So we fast forward from 1956 to 1964, which is when we saw the emergence of the Civil Rights Act, which is a piece of legislation that guarantees the rights of citizenship to all citizens. But unfortunately, the language of the law is crafted in such a way that when these cases were brought by these civil rights organizations about the ways that racism was being meted out through highway policies, road and bridge construction, the language and the way that the language was crafted was such that changes to the policies could not take place until after the construction was built. So we go back to the example of what Robert Moses did in New York by constructing bridges with 1 foot less clearance space. Of course, once the bridge is erected, they're not going to tear it down. So you see where I'm going with this. Mm-hmm. And over time, during that decade, more and more legal scholars and civil rights leaders were seeing how, while the laws were intended to promote racial equity, in practice, they really weren't. And so it wasn't until the 1970s that we began to see the emergence of what is called critical race theory. Critical race theory comes from the legal academy because many civil rights attorneys were seeing that the ways in which language in the laws and legislation was crafted was ineffective as it relates to combating race and racism. The purpose of critical race theory is to truthfully and systematically examine the role of race and racism in society. That is its purpose. The goal of critical race theory is to eliminate the racism as a whole, and then I'll just stop there.
Wow. So, so when folks are at their boards of education upset and fighting about critical race theory, what do they imagine they are fighting against?
I'm not sure, but if you look at just the idea of what this tool, critical race theory, is crafted to do, it's really a tool that steps into the breach where legislation, civil rights legislation, and the like falls short. It's a way of rigorously examining the presence of race and racism in our social institutions. But I want to be very clear in demarcating the type of racism that critical race theory is targeting. So when we think about racism, there are 4 major types of racism. We have individual racism, which is the single person who espouses a racist ideology. We have interpersonal racism, where you may have groupings of people who are practicing ideas or behaviors that are racist in orientation. We have institutionalized racism, which is a racism that can be nested within an organization. But then, Babz, there is structural racism. And the structural racism is a type of racism in which racism is nested within the social institutions of America. It is structural racism that is the target and focus of critical race theory.
So when they built that bridge the way they built it, that is institutional racism.
It's institutional and structural, literally
and
structural.
Structural, yes. Okay. Go on.
So when you hear people in this time talk about the ways that critical race theory is a breach, is perpetuating lies and mistruths, is making people feel bad, that's not the intent of critical race theory. Critical race theory is simply a tool to expose and examine the presence of race and racism within our social institutions for the purpose of reducing and ultimately eliminating said racism.
So I would imagine that people would want to do that so that we could move further along in our educational system, like so that we could move further along, so that people can have an understanding of where racism is structural, where racism ought to be rooted out. I mean, so I'm not it seems like there's a disconnect between the truth and what people are imagining out there. Like, I just get the sense that they think that they're just that people are out here trying to sort of change American history by not telling the truth.
American history was changed from its very inception. If you use the example of the first encounter by indigenous people with Europeans. We know the story of Thanksgiving, where Native Americans and Europeans gathered together for a meal. It was a pleasant experience, but the truth of the matter is far different. And we are at a point in time where America has yet again another opportunity to confront itself, to confront its present, to confront its past, in the effort to try to make things better for the next generation. That is very difficult work to do, because in looking honestly and looking critically at the truth, it is going to expose a number of horrors. We have to have the stomach to be able to endure that. And it will be that allows us to move forward ultimately. But if we are continuing to deflect, if we are continuing to deny, we are continuing to tell lies about the truth, then we're not going to move forward. And this is why tools such as critical race theory are receiving the backlash that you are seeing across the country, but also why those who are proponents of critical race theory must continue to lead the fight. And I should say that critical race theory, while it emerged in the 1970s, it grew and expanded in the 80s and 90s. And so critical race theory is not just relegated to issues of race and racism with regard to Black and white people. It's also focused, there are branches of critical race theory that target indigenous communities. There are branches of critical race theory that target Latino communities. There are branches of critical race theory that target Asian communities. So critical race theory is a tool that has expanded over time and continues to grow, but it is quite necessary because the backlash that we've seen over the last several years says what? That we are not interested in looking at the truth. We are not interested in helping to make things better. In fact, we're interested in turning things backwards. And this is why we have to continue to be a part of this movement that pushes things forward in a positive direction. And I must say, too, that there are people across the racial spectrum that are proponents and advocates of critical race theory. But it is a tool, again, that is simply seeking the truth. In its barest essence, it's simply seeking the truth. That's it.
So when teachers are having their hands tied because they take issue with books that say enslaved people were guest workers, and they have food and shelter, and not all of them were treated unfairly by the plantations that hosted them. And I've seen these I've seen this in Texas books and handouts that teachers have been giving, and there are teachers who are outright saying, this is not true, I don't want to teach this, and then they get slammed with, well, you're trying to teach critical race theory.
No, it's really unfortunate that the intensity of the pushback is what we've seen over the last year or so with regard to critical race theory. But there is so much evidence that supports the reason why critical race theory is so needed in this time. And one of the articles that I would point your listeners and viewers to is written by a professor of law at Vanderbilt University. Her name is Deborah Archer. And the title of this article is White Men's Roads Through Black Men's Homes. And it provides a wonderful and robust illustration of the ways in which racism has been an integral part of the systems of America since its inception. But she specifically targets the ways in which the highway system has been nested with the racism. And I would encourage those who are so inclined to take a look at this article, because the reason that I wanted to use the Interstate Highway Act of 1956 as the example, Babz, is because here we are again. The president is eagerly awaiting the opportunity to sign this infrastructure package, which I believe amounts to about $110 billion for the restoration of interstates, roads, bridges, and the like. But here's the thing. What is critically important about this time is once those funds have been handed down by the Congress, and the president signs this bill into law, it is absolutely essential that Black people, brown people, and poor people be at the decision-making table. Because if not, past will become prologue. We will see a repeat of what we saw 65 years ago and in the years hence.
I think we are seeing, because I read a piece, something that came across my inner city desk about, I think there's some folks protesting, I want to say in Detroit or Atlanta or it's somewhere where there is a large population of Black people, and they want to run a highway that will cut this community. And I was like, they're still doing that?
No, they're still doing it. And again, it's happening silently. And this is why people have to continue to speak out. And this is why when decisions get made about how these resources are going to be allocated, again, people from the very communities that will be impacted first, often Black communities, need to be at the table, along with the stakeholders, the advocates, and the person who are making policy to ensure that these activities are going to be deployed in a way that promotes racial equity. And so one of the tools that I recommend be used is what is called racial equity impact studies. Racial equity impact studies. And what these do is they systematically analyze how racial and ethnic groups can be affected by a proposed action or policy. Now, the best time to deploy a racial equity impact study is during the decision-making process, not after. So the idea of the racial equity impact studies is a proactive mechanism so that, again, the people who will be most impacted by these policies and changes will be at the decision-making table, not in a titular head fashion, but actually be empowered and have some say as to how the resources are allocated, but also what are the contingencies for the disruption to the communities that may take place as a result of the infrastructural changes.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so how do we? I mean, I think this is a great conversation, because I think people are out there feeling like they're fighting this fight against misinformation. All the while, on the back end, these kinds of things are happening. It's like look at me over here, but look what I'm doing over here, and it's like a division of our attention. So how do we sort of pay attention to developers and all these other kinds of things, and when cities and towns take eminent domain, and I think it's all connected. How do we do that? Particularly when we're starting to find out now that Black communities are starting to look good to developers on a lot of levels. You can call it gentrification, you can call it whatever you want. We're starting to look good for developers to come into communities and say, let's build.
Good for whom? Good for whom?
That's what I mean. That good for whom?
So again, we have got to be sure that we are as politically engaged as possible, that we are holding our local elected leaders accountable, that we are privy to the plans that are in city halls, in cities around the nation, as it relates to building projects, the types of companies that are being engaged to carry out this types of work. But we also need to understand the ways in which this infrastructure package is likely to be deployed. And so this is where community leaders and stakeholders have to become better advocates on behalf of the people that they are serving, to make sure that their interests are not only being heard, but that their interests are being addressed. Because otherwise we will be on the sidelines yet again, and we will see the fragmentation and destruction of our communities that in many instances have never recovered. And we will be further displaced as an incredibly diverse community of people. So knowing what is going on in your community at the local level, at the grassroots level, is really important. But we have to use our organizations, like the urban leagues, like the NAACPs, like other local businesses, to make sure that our voices are being heard on this topic. Because if not, the decisions will be made without us being in the room, and you know what happens when that occurs. We tend to get the short end of the stick. And if we're not careful, we will continue to see these Construction projects further fragment and destroy our communities. As we speak, there is a significant amount of protestation occurring in Charleston, South Carolina, because one of the main arteries, I-526, which connects I-26 to I-95, is being widened. But the construction project is focused specifically on the Black communities, not the white communities. So again, we see that there has been this sort of transference from one century to another of some of the same practices that have facilitated the demise and destruction of Black communities. So we've got to be aware of what is going on. We have to get the word out to people so that they know. And that's why I'm thankful to be on your show, to be able to talk about this now, so more and more people understand what is going on. Because one of the biggest deficits, I think, is lack of access to the information. And so once we get the information out to more people, we position ourselves to respond in a more proactive manner as opposed to have to react.
So long, that's the long game. But teachers right now, there are decisions being made across this country about what is taught in schools, what is taught and what is not taught in schools. And teachers are being, hands are being tied around legislation that is prohibiting them from teaching American history in a way that tells the truth about American history. So how do parents, how do communities push back on that kind of direct assault on our educational system, particularly when it relates to the history of this country?
Babz, attitude reflects leadership. We have to look at the people who are in positions of leadership. We have to look at the boards of education around the country. We have to look at the composition of those boards, which means that we may have to become far more active and engaged as opposed to being passive in those decisions. Because as we see, there has been a persistent movement to turn things back. And without getting too far afield, one of the things that happens is when you have certain groups of people in power who feel that they are impervious to consequences, they tend to do what? What's in their best interest. And so we have to be in a position where people are held to account, that there are consequences for these decisions. There are consequences for willfully putting mechanisms and policy in place that are going to disenfranchise some groups and place other groups at a significant advantage. So until we get to a space where we can more collectively pool our power, whether it's through the voting booth, whether it's economically, whether it's politically, then we put ourselves in positions where we are more likely to be susceptible to being handed what others want to give us, as opposed to be a collaborator in the decision-making processes.
Because there's, I mean, you know, Dr. Brown, there's a real march on the retelling or the revisionist of history, the revision of history, starting at the various earliest level, not just at the collegiate level, but mostly at the elementary, high school levels, where if you can put misinformation out there at that level, how do you reteach, re-educate people at later? You know, if they're ingrained with this.
But this goes back to what we have spoken about before, and that is the ability to engage in thinking that's based on common sense, but also having the capacity to think critically. And because we are in this space now where, quite honestly, democracy is on the line, we find ourselves in situations where more and more people feel that they have the power to tell you what the truth is. as opposed to what the actual truth is. So that means it is a responsibility of every person for themselves to do the appropriate level of due diligence to find out, well, why is it that this person holds this particular point of view? What are the pros and cons? What will this person gain? What will this group gain as opposed to another group? And have these conversations with your family. Have these conversations in your community so you can come to more informed, reasoned decisions. But because of the influx of lies, because of the influx of propaganda, because of the influx of hyperbole, it can make it very difficult to be able to parse between what is true and what is not. And this, again, is what critical race theory seeks to address by conducting a systematic analysis of an issue, by pulling forth the tenets of race and racism within the issue that is structurally based for the purposes of revealing the truth. And you have to ask yourself the question, what are some people afraid of? What are you so afraid of that you would do almost anything to keep the truth from coming forth? And I want to say this. There's also been a lot of talk about the impact of critical race theory on the hearts and minds of white children. But no one seems to stop to say, but what about the impact of racism on Black children, on brown children, on Asian children, on indigenous children? No one has that conversation. So part of what critical race theory does is it is a facilitator of equity for the purpose of getting to what? Justice. What have we said before? Justice is what? The highest principle of fair dealing. And that in part is what critical race theory seeks to achieve.
Wow. I like that. You need to go around the country and talk about this, or just go to Guilford and be in New Haven and be all over the places talking about this, because I'm seeing these conversations and I'm seeing these school boards systematically tying teachers' hands about what they believe critical race theory is. And parents being, white parents in particular being, I don't want my kids knowing about this, that, and the other thing.
But again, that is because of the fear and because of the way that critical race theory has been promoted over the last few years, with a severely skewed bias towards that tool. It creates a lot of emotional discomfort. And what that does is when a person becomes emotional, what have you done? You have removed their ability to think well. And what you see is the difference between a response versus a reaction. A reaction, Babz, as you know, is impulsive. Mm-hmm. It's emotionally charged. But a response is what? It's thoughtful. Now, you could have groups of people in the same room who have completely divergent views on critical race theory. But if you were to explain what critical race theory is, as opposed to what it is not, chances are you might have some who come to a different understanding of what it is. They may not necessarily agree with it, but if it is presented in an objective, fair-minded way, most reasonable people, again, while they may not agree with it, will say, okay, I have a much better understanding of that. I didn't know that that's what it was. I thought it was just trying to upset my child, and nothing or no one's going to upset my child. So we have to use this opportunity to do as much educating as we possibly can. But I will say this, critical race theory is here to stay. It's not going anywhere.
And that, my friends, is why Dr. Robert M. Brown III is talking to us this morning. Critical race theory is here to stay. I find this whole conversation quite fascinating. I know the people that are listening, people have been waiting for this conversation since I posted it. So I thank you so much, Dr. Brown. I would like you to come back and let's unpack it a little bit more so that people really get a sense of what we're up against and what we're and what the engagement looks like when we say it's here to stay, and using it as a tool for which it was intended.
Yes.
So thank you. Thank you very much. I appreciate this conversation.
Yeah, I hope that it helps to clear up some of the misinformation around critical race theory. And as you said, the misinformation is deliberate. It's deliberate. And there is far too much at stake now. There just is. And the more we can talk about these issues, and again, it doesn't mean that we're going to agree on everything, because we're different. The more we perhaps come to an understanding on just a basic human level as to how, if we do a little bit more of this and a little bit less of that, it can help to make life better for a lot of people. Mm-hmm. And isn't that what we all want? Isn't that what we want for our children and grandchildren? That they be able to live lives that are not riddled with some of these issues that we have refused to address for centuries. The time is now.
Thank you, Dr. Robert Brown. Yes, everyone, he will be back, and we will unpack some more of this. And we still have to continue our conversation of looking at the state of Black Connecticut through a COVID lens, or Black America through a COVID lens, because COVID is pretty much with us.
Yes,
and we are still suffering.
Be here. Yes.
I mean, we're still suffering from this. We are still, we're still dying at larger numbers. We're still suffering at larger numbers. We are still, it is still decimating our community. Yeah, so we'll still talk about that. So thank you.
Thank you. It's great to be with you.
It's good to be with you, and it's good to see you, and peace and blessings. And I can't wait till you come back.
All right. I look forward to it.
Thank you, Dr. Brown.
All right. Thank
you.
Have
a good day.
You as well.
All right. Okay, Harry, I know that you got your lesson on critical race theory. So I'm out, people. I'll be back tomorrow with Elm Shakespeare, because they've got a production coming up this weekend that I think people will be really interested in. And so they're going to come on tomorrow morning at 10:15 and talk about what they're up to for Halloween. Thanks, Harry. I can't hear you.
I'm gonna have to go back and look at, listen to the show.
Oh yeah, because you were working.
Yeah, I was doing stuff. Doing stuff.
You can go back and listen. So yeah, he'll be back. You know he will. And so Elm Shakespeare tomorrow, 10:15.
Yep.
So we're doing all the talking. So y'all have a good day. Stay dry, or at least don't be as wet. I'll see y'all.
Yep. See you tomorrow.
Yep.
Rawls-Ivy from New Haven, Connecticut, and you're listening to WNHHLP 103.5 FM, streaming live at newhavenindependent.org.
Keep me moving till the morning light. Gonna ride all night, ride all night. Wheels keep spinning till the morning light. Gonna ride all night, ride all night. Keep me moving till the morning light. Wheels keep spinning spinning to the morning light. Wheels keep spinning. Wheels keep spinning. Wheels keep spinning to the morning light. Wheels keep spinning. Wheels keep spinning. Wheels keep spinning to the morning light. Wheels keep spinning. Wheels keep spinning. Wheels keep spinning to the morning light.